Moscow, 1991. Red Square was flooded with a sea of people. Cameras were recording. Yeltsin stepped up to the podium. But the few sentences he spoke that day were erased from history. Those words don't exist in official records. However, a few people who were there still whisper the same sentence. If that recording had been released, the Soviets would have collapsed much earlier. So what did Yeltsin say? Why was that speech completely removed from state archives? Today, we're tracing those words that echoed in Red Square, but were never heard. It was August heat, and there was a strange silence over Moscow. The Soviet Union was taking its last breaths, but no one was aware of it yet. Millions of people had poured into the streets, and Red Square was witnessing perhaps one of history's most critical moments. Boris Yeltsin, in a white shirt on top of tanks, with a microphone in his hand, addressed the people. There were dozens of cameras recording that moment. Television channels were broadcasting live. But right at this point, a gap began to form between the history that was told and the history that occurred. Because some of the words Yeltsin spoke that day don't appear in any official archive. And this situation wasn't just a simple technical error. This was the result of a conscious choice. Now, if you're watching this video and haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe. Because on this channel, we don't tell ordinary history. We pursue truths that are forgotten, hidden, and sometimes deliberately erased in the dark corners of history. And this story is perhaps one of the greatest mysteries. Yeltsin's Red Square speech is considered one of the turning points in world history. But actually, more than one speech was made that day. There were 3 different speeches. Yes, 3. The first was in the early morning hours. During the hours when the military coup attempt had just begun, Yeltsin addressed the people in front of the Russian parliament building. The second speech was made at noon, and this speech was relatively well documented. The third speech was made as evening darkness fell, in Red Square, in front of only a few hundred people. And the secret lies precisely in this third speech. There's a retired journalist living in Moscow. His name is Dmitry Volkov, 90 years old. His eyes still carry the clarity of that day. In an interview he gave in 2018, Volkov said, "I was there that evening, in the corner of Red Square, with a small crowd." Yeltsin was tired, his voice was hoarse. But the words he spoke, those words were the kind no one could dare to utter. He talked about the KGB's darkest secrets. He spoke about the real cause of Chernobyl. And most importantly, he claimed that Gorbachev's plans were actually a scenario from start to finish. Volkov's hands were trembling as he said these words. Because after that evening, the recordings mysteriously disappeared. And many people like Volkov who were there either remained silent or disappeared in the following years. But now we need to ask a critical question. Did this speech really happen? Or is this a legend made up by conspiracy theorists? This is where some concrete evidence comes into play. In 1992, a technician working at Moscow State Television, a man named Andrei Petrov, was organizing tapes in the archives as part of his duty. In Petrov's diary, there's a note dated August 1991. The note reads, "Today, an order came from upper management. All recordings from the evening of August 22nd will be destroyed." I asked why. They didn't answer. They only said the order came from the KGB. This diary was revealed by Petrov's family after his death and was discussed in Russian media for a while. But then the agenda changed. The matter was forgotten. But what about the other witnesses? There were hundreds of people in Red Square that night. Why did they all remain silent? The truth is, they didn't remain silent. However, their testimonies never reached the masses. For example, a teacher named Svetlana Ivanova was in the square that evening with her students. Years later, in an interview she gave to a local newspaper in 2005, she recounted that Yeltsin used the phrase betrayal from within the system, and that immediately after these words, security personnel around him intervened. According to Ivanova's account, the microphone was suddenly cut off and Yeltsin was hurriedly removed from there. But this detail was never reflected in official history. The collapse of the Soviet Union appears to be one of the best documented events in world history. Every moment under camera, every word recorded. But the truth is, the writing of history is always in the hands of the powerful. And the powerful sometimes prefer certain truths to be forgotten. Yeltsin's lost speech is exactly such a truth. Because if what he said is true, what happened in the final days of the Soviet regime is much more complex and dirty than we know today. Now I want to introduce you to another witness. Viktor Chernov, the son of a clerk who worked in the KGB's archive department. His father died mysteriously in 1994. Chernov says his father gave him something before his death, an old audio tape. What's on the tape? Chernov briefly mentioned this in a documentary in 2011, but didn't go into detail. He only said this: "My father told me that this recording had Yeltsin's voice on it, but some parts of the recording have been erased. Who erased it? Why they erased it, I don't know. But my father lost his life for keeping this tape." After Chernov said these words, he disappeared. We lost his trail. There's no definitive information about the content of what Yeltsin said that evening. But when various testimonies are brought together, some common points emerge. First, Yeltsin is said to have used striking statements about the Chernobyl disaster. Chernobyl occurred in 1986, and according to the official statement, it resulted from an operator error. But Yeltsin, that evening, claimed that this was actually deliberate sabotage and that a group within the KGB was behind it. Why? Because they wanted to undermine Gorbachev's glasnost and perestroika policies. The Chernobyl disaster showed the world how rotten the Soviet system was, and this accelerated the regime's end. But if this was not an accident, but a deliberate act, then all of history must be rewritten. Second, Yeltsin is said to have talked about divisions within the KGB. The 1991 coup attempt wasn't just the last gasp of communist conservatives. Actually, this was the external manifestation of a power struggle that had been going on within the KGB for years. One group supported Gorbachev's reforms, while the other group wanted to return everything to its former state. And Yeltsin, that evening, recounted the details of this secret war. What names did he give? What operations did he mention? We don't know, because those parts were deleted from the recordings. Third, Yeltsin is alleged to have talked about relationships with Western intelligence services. This is one of the most sensitive points in Soviet history. Did Yeltsin have secret meetings with the US and UK in the late 1980s? If so, what was the content of these meetings? Did the collapse of the Soviets really come from within, or did external powers also play a role? What Yeltsin said that evening, if true, changes everything we know about the end of the Cold War. But perhaps the most striking claim is this. Yeltsin said that Gorbachev was actually aware of the coup attempt and turned a blind eye to it. Why? Because Gorbachev wanted the coup attempt to fail and himself to return as a hero. However, the plan backfired. Yeltsin came to the fore and Gorbachev was buried in history's dusty shelves. If this is true, the August 1991 coup is one of history's biggest false flag operations. Of course, these are all claims. No evidence, no recording. But sometimes history's greatest truths are the events that leave the least evidence. Because the powerful know very well how to erase their traces. Now I want to show you another dimension. What happened after Yeltsin's lost speech? First, a strange cleaning operation began in Moscow. After August 1991, dozens of people working in KGB archives were removed from their positions. Some were retired, some were transferred to other departments. And at least 5 people died in mysterious accidents. One of them was Andrei Petrov, the television technician I mentioned earlier. He died in a traffic accident in 1993. The official report said brake failure, but an independent mechanic who examined his car claimed that the brake system had been deliberately sabotaged. Of course, no one listened to him. Second, Yeltsin himself never spoke about this. In his farewell speech in 2000 when he retired, he mentioned some regrets about the past, but never mentioned that evening. When he died in 2007, this was one of the secrets he took to his grave. So why did Yeltsin remain silent? Perhaps he knew the price of speaking would be too heavy. Perhaps there was an agreement. Perhaps he never said those words, and this is just a legend. But the interesting thing is this. Some names from Yeltsin's close circle made strange confessions years later. For example, Yeltsin's former press advisor Pavel Vashinov said in an interview in 2015, "Not everything said in August 1991 was recorded. Some truths were dangerous for Russia's future. What kind of truths? Vashanov didn't explain, but such statements do nothing but fuel curiosity. Another interesting point is the Western media's reaction. The Western media extensively covered the August 1991 coup. CNN, BBC, all major channels were in Moscow. But there's no mention of Yeltsin's speech that evening. Why? Because wasn't the Western media there? Or did they also take the recordings and archive them? These questions still remain unanswered today. In the 2000s, with the internet age, this issue came back on the agenda. Some conspiracy theory sites claimed they published the transcript of Yeltsin's lost speech. But these transcripts didn't resemble each other at all. Some claimed Yeltsin talked about aliens. Some said he mentioned Stalin was still alive. So there was serious information pollution. And this pollution made finding the truth even more difficult. But in 2010, there was a development. Olga Sokolova, a history professor at Moscow State University, accessed some classified minutes from August 1991 in her research in Soviet archives. These minutes were the KGB's internal correspondence from those days. In a document Sokolova found, it was written, "The recording of Yeltsin's speech at 2300 hours on August 22nd will be immediately destroyed." High-level order. There was a signature at the bottom of the document, but the name had been erased. Sokolova published this document in an academic journal. But the journal closed a month later. Sokolova resigned from the university and moved abroad. Today she lives in Germany and doesn't speak about this subject. Now you're wondering too, aren't you? What did Yeltsin really say? And why is it so important? Perhaps the answer lies not so much in what was said, but in what wasn't said. Perhaps Yeltsin exposed the dark games, betrayals, and secret agreements that took place in the final days of the Soviet system, one by one. Perhaps that speech showed not only how the Soviets worked, but how the entire world order functions. And this was very dangerous information. The collapse of the Soviet Union, according to the official narrative, is the triumph of freedom and democracy. The people rose up, toppled the dictatorship, a new era began. But is the truth this simple? When we look at history, no major change has occurred cleanly. Every revolution, every collapse harbors countless intrigues, betrayals, and secret agreements behind it. And the end of the Soviets was no different. Yeltsin was a complex figure. On one hand, a folk hero, on the other, someone from within the system. He served in the Communist Party for years, was part of Gorbachev's team. Then he became an opponent, sided with the people. But did he really? Or is this also a game? Perhaps Yeltsin told exactly this that evening. Perhaps he said, "I was also part of this game." And this confession was of a nature to shake the entire system. I want to give another example about history's erased pages. In the 1950s, after Stalin's death, Khrushchev gave a secret speech. In this speech, he recounted Stalin's crimes, his terror, that he was responsible for the deaths of millions of people. This speech is one of the turning points in Soviet history. But interestingly, this speech also remained secret for years. How did it leak to the West? Through the CIA. So sometimes history's most important moments are learned through secret channels. Yeltsin's lost speech may also one day be found somewhere by someone and presented to the world. Or perhaps it will be lost forever. Now I want to take you to another dimension. Let's say Yeltsin's speech was found and published. What would happen? What would be its impact on today's Russia? Putin-era Russia is trying to revive Soviet nostalgia. Stalin is being heroized again. The Soviet period is referred to as a period of stability. If Yeltsin's words came out, this narrative could collapse. Because those words would reveal how rotten the system was, how much it was based on lies. And this is an existential threat to the Putin regime. Perhaps this is why those recordings are still being kept. Perhaps Russia's current security services know where those tapes are. Perhaps somewhere inside steel safes, in a place no one can reach, they sit. And perhaps one day, when there's a new revolution in Russia, those safes will be opened and the truth will emerge. Or perhaps it never will. History is written by the powerful. This is a truth we all know. But sometimes, the testimonies of the powerless also remain somewhere. In a diary, in a letter, in an audio tape. And those testimonies, when their time comes, rewrite history. Yeltsin's lost speech may also be such a testimony. Perhaps right now, somewhere in the world, in someone's home, it sits on an old cassette, and that person is waiting to share it with the world. As you watch this video, perhaps you're thinking, is this real or just a conspiracy theory? You're right. In the age of the internet, it's very difficult to distinguish reality from fiction. Everyone claims something. Everyone knows something. But what's true is this. It's true that Yeltsin gave a speech that evening. It's true that the recordings of that speech disappeared. And it's true that some witnesses gave consistent statements about this. The rest is open to interpretation. Perhaps Yeltsin gave a simple speech that evening and the recordings were lost due to a technical problem. Or perhaps, as said, he exposed one of history's greatest secrets and was therefore silenced. Which is true. I don't know. But what I know is this. As long as history isn't questioned, it remains as the powerful want it. And our duty is to continue asking questions. Yeltsin's lost speech isn't just a matter of history. This is also a matter concerning today. Because today, too, every day, countless events occur in the world, and some don't enter the official narrative. Some news is ignored, some truths are hidden. And years later, when future generations research what's happening today, perhaps like us, they'll pursue lost recordings. Perhaps they'll ask, what happened in 2025? Why is this event nowhere? The flow of history isn't shaped only by major events. Sometimes, a small speech, a small document can change everything. Yeltsin's lost speech may also be such a key. Perhaps this speech will enable us to understand the real reason for the Soviets' collapse, the real end of the Cold War, and how today's world order was established. Or perhaps it will change nothing. Because people sometimes don't want to hear the truth. On that hot evening in August 1991, in Red Square, as Yeltsin was speaking, no one fully understood the importance of that moment. The people there were just listening to a leader's speech. But perhaps that moment was one of history's most critical moments. Perhaps those words, if they had been heard, would have changed the world much earlier. Perhaps nothing would have changed. But we'll never know, because those words were buried in the dark corners of history. Dmitry Volkov, the 90-year-old journalist, is still alive. Sometimes, at night, he remembers that day. When he closes his eyes, he hears Yeltsin's voice. If you want to know the truth, look in the archives, Yeltsin says. But which archives? Where? Volkov doesn't know. No one knows. Perhaps no one ever will. History's unwritten pages are sometimes more important than the written ones. Because those pages show us how the system works, how truth is manipulated. Yeltsin's lost speech is also such a page. Perhaps it never existed. Perhaps it existed, but was lost forever. Which option is more frightening? I don't know. This story has no ending. Because this story is still continuing. Perhaps tomorrow, someone will come forward and say, I found that recording. Perhaps no one will. But what's important is this. We must continue asking questions. Because as long as history isn't questioned, it's only the winner's story. And the stories of the losers, the oppressed, the silenced remain in darkness. Red Square is still there today. Tourists take photos, children play. But that square's stones still carry the secrets of August 1991. Perhaps one day, those stones will speak. Perhaps they never will. But we will continue listening. Because truth, sooner or later, emerges. Perhaps tomorrow, perhaps 100 years from now. But it definitely emerges. The words Yeltsin spoke that evening may never be known. But the very possibility that those words exist tells us a lot. It shows how fragile history is, how easily truth can be manipulated, and how easily the powerful can erase their traces. And this isn't just a lesson about the past. It's also a lesson about today. Now, as you watch this video, ask yourself this. Today, right now, what truths are being hidden? Which speeches are being deleted from recordings? Which witnesses are being silenced? Perhaps years from now, future generations will ask similar questions about our era. And perhaps they won't find answers. Because history repeats itself. The powerful always try to control the truth. And our duty is to continue resisting that control. Yeltsin's lost speech will continue to remain a mystery. Perhaps forever. But this mystery teaches us something important. We must always approach history with skepticism. We must question the official narrative. And we must never give up searching for the truth. Because truth sometimes hides in the most unexpected places, in the darkest corners. And finding it is our responsibility. That was our story about Yeltsin today. Do you think that audio recording will be found? Let us know in the comments. And to hear more scandals about Boris Yeltsin, you can like my video and subscribe to my channel.